Carter is one of my high school journalism students, and he's been getting up earlier and earlier. In fact, he's been getting up at 3 in the morning to drive 40 miles to the town next to us to help the farmer transition cows to an earlier milking, because those cows need to be transported at the end of the month. And dairy cows are a little temperamental when it comes to milking. So it's a delicate balance. Each week, they move that milking time earlier and earlier, and Carter's there. Except at the end of the month, he's going to need to look for a new job, because that one's going to be over. At this moment, though, he's in my journalism class, having worked a full day's work on that farm before ever coming to school. Alan has been living on his own for 2 years. He's an emancipated minor, and in his public speaking class, he tells an incredibly moving story about how living on your own at 17 doesn't seem as cool as some of his classmates think it is. In fact, the story that he tells about being on his own is a lot more about loneliness and sometimes darkness. Sarah has a 1-year-old daughter, and her daughter's recently been diagnosed with high levels of blood in her, or high levels of lead. Hopefully she has high levels of blood. High levels of lead in her blood. And they can't seem to figure out where her daughter has been exposed to it. She's recently heard back from her 3rd doctor, and she's missed 29 days in my journalism class. What do you do with that? What do you do with those stories? I've had the privilege of working in a whole variety of different schools, from an affluent district just outside the main borough of Philadelphia to the middle of Michigan in a very rural community surrounded by farms. And now I find myself in a suburban school here in our area. And what I've found is that no matter the situation, no matter the students, there's one thing that remains constant. All students want to be heard. They want to be valued, and they want to be understood. They are struggling to understand their roles, their identities, and their purpose. So whether they are from an urban school or a rural school, whether from a suburban school or somewhere in between, our adolescents are begging to know that their voices matter. There's power in words. And unfortunately, my students don't always realize that. They're so in the depth of their own stories that they don't realize they have stories. They just do what they do. And when you ask them to tell a story, no, I don't have any story to tell. But they can tell you how to field dress a deer like an expert. They can tell you how to restore a 57 Chevy. They can tell you where to find the best refurbished auto parts and how to clip goats' hooves. No kidding. And they can tell you the best places to go kayaking, how to catch wind when they're snowboarding. But these are not stories, Miss Ward. That's just what we do. Until you start to ask them to unpack that. So why did you refurbish that 57 Chevy? And Isaac will tell you, when he came home from his father's funeral, it was sitting on the front lawn. And him and his father looked at that truck and knew they had to restore it to its former glory. Together they worked side by side, not always real well, which we heard stories about, but they worked side by side. And it was that truck, touched both by the grandfather and his father and then himself, that weaved their histories together. That truck weaved together their traditions, weaved together what mattered most to them. And when you see it in the school parking lot, and it's that shiny robin's egg blue with the wood panels on the side, oh, you better know that truck stands out. Everybody in town knows who that truck belongs to. And Isaac will tell you, yeah, it's road ready, but it's not road safe. Kind of like my grandfather. And you can hear it. It's that kind of like my grandfather. That's the story. And it's kind of teasing that out because stories matter. Unfortunately, by the time students come to me as high school students, they don't always see that because they've been told or sometimes shown that their voices don't matter, that their experiences aren't valued. And so when I ask them to write an essay about what's a core belief that you hold dear, and tell me why that core belief has shaped you and how. First of all, I probably shouldn't ask them to do that in the first week of school. That's a little tough. But it takes some time, and after a couple weeks, or sometimes longer than a couple weeks, they bring those stories to the classroom. And they don't just pour out, they flood our classroom. And that's really important, not only because it's important for our students to feel the authors of their own story, but it's important for my classroom, my community of listeners, to hear those lives, to hear that passion, to build compassion and to build empathy, because that's what stories do. They build empathy. So we must open ourselves up to that vulnerability, to bring those stories to light. So 4 years ago, same assignment. I introduce it to my sophomores. They're a little giddy. It may have been before lunch. And they start to kind of talk about, okay, what are you going to write about? I don't know. And Emily comes rushing. Miss Ward, I have this idea. I don't think I can write about it. Okay, Emily, calm down. Go home. Just write. Just write. She messaged me a little bit later in the day. School had ended. Miss Ward, I've got this idea. I want to write about how life is going to let you down and it will fail you. And I want to include my experiences and my family's experiences with my father's cancer. But you said that we should write about our everyday experiences. So can I still write about that? And of course, I messaged her right back, yes, Emily, please write your story. 20 minutes later, I get a phone call from my dad. And he's many, many miles away. 3 states are between us. And he says, that tumor in my stomach, I just got the biopsy back. It's cancer. Cancer. My dad has cancer. The next day, go into the classroom and my students busy on the Chromebooks, typing their drafts. Emily calls me over. Miss Ward, okay, read what I got. And her first lines are about how she feels purposeless, how she feels like she doesn't know what she's going to do because her father has died of brain cancer. What do you do with that? I know what I did. I broke down. I started crying in front of my class. And in a very quick effort to try and pull myself together, I turn to Emily and I say, I'm sorry. Right after our conversation, I learned that my father had cancer. And I will never forget what Emily said back to me, because it was the most compassionate, empathetic, mature thing I have ever had someone say to me. She said, I'm not going to pretend that I understand what you're going through, because everybody's journey with cancer is different. Here's what I know. I know that right now is really scary, and I know that it's going to be hard. She goes home, I go home, a mess. She comes back the next day, and she hands me an envelope. And in the envelope is a 5-page, single-spaced letter that she's typed. This letter. And she shares with me her story. And she shares with me everything that she's learned from her journey. And I'm not going to go through and I'm not going to read what she's written in great detail because it's not my story to tell. But when she took that moment to sit down and share her story with me, it interwove our stories and it changed my story. She ended the letter with, now that you know my family story, I want to tell you things that I hope will be helpful for you during you and your family's journey. First, this is going to be hard. There's no way of sugarcoating it. There are going to be days when you cry yourself to sleep and ask yourself, why me? Why him? Why is this happening to my family? Those are the same questions that I asked myself almost every day. Even now, I still do. Things happen to us that nobody can explain. It just isn't fair that he, out of all people, got cancer. Just remember, Miss Ward, that your father getting cancer is out of your circle of control. Second, cherish the moments you have with him. Appreciate every time you spend with him, even if they are unpleasant. and there will be unpleasant moments, but you have to make the most of them, no matter how sad they are. Yes, our stories are different, but I know what it is like to have a father with cancer. Please keep this letter someplace special, because maybe there will be one day when you want to read this and think, oh yeah, I remember Emily, she wrote this letter. I love this, she's 16, it's so perfect. Later that night, we had back to school night, which is when we invite the parents to come into the school and meet the different teachers and ask questions. And her mom walks up to me. I'm Emily's mom. You inspired my daughter. Last night, she printed out that letter that she wrote to you, and she shared it with me. And there are things in that letter that she has never spoken. And it's that moment when I start crying again. But two, when I realize that connection, that moment between student and parent and teacher, that's why stories matter. Because when I took a chance, a little bit involuntarily, to be vulnerable and to share my story, Emily in turn shared her story with me. And Emily needed to tell her story, and I needed to hear her story. That's the power of stories, right? That's what makes us human beings. Stories are at the heart of what makes us human. They are most vulnerable. We need to be teaching this in schools more, because it's those stories that help us see past the labels, past the labels we put on ourselves. It's stories that help to build bridges. And that is key in a world that we live in today. It helps especially when our students see themselves only as consumers of information. When they can write their story and share their story, they become creators. They move from object to agent. Unfortunately, it seems that we don't value stories all that much in our current educational system. We place a lot of value through our Common Core state standards on persuasive writing and on informational writing, expository, and argumentation. And those are technical writing skills, and that's good. We need those, but we need to balance it. We need to bring life and light into what it is that we're doing in the classroom, because it's not just young people that need these skills. It's old people and all people. This practice of telling stories is one that we all need to learn in order to better our world. Unfortunately, like I said, that's not always valued, and the problem becomes in that is when we don't value those stories, when we get focused on how do we measure progress and how do we measure growth, we ultimately end up undervaluing those very same things which we do and should be teaching our students, those things that aren't quantifiable, things like resilience and grit, empathy, compassion, reflection, revision. When I give my students a section of text and I say, okay, what's the mood in this section? Because that's what English teachers do. I need to keep in mind that that's not a measure of who they're going to be once they step outside the doors of my classroom. How they perform on a particular test is not who a kid is, but we put so much emphasis on those tests and not so much emphasis on the stories. So what I'm asking us to think about is, what is it that we value in learning and in education? Because what is the value of an education if it doesn't include the individual's experience? What's the value of school if it doesn't include the opportunity to make mistakes and learn from them and grow from them and revise? What's the value of learning if we're not creative, critical thinkers, and that takes time to develop? What is the value of my class if I'm not showing my students what it means to be empathetic through the stories that I share? As a teacher, I'm not just a content expert. I hope I'm a content expert. But more than that, I want to be a model of my hope for the future. And the future that I hope for is one that is connected, that is creative, and yes, that writes well and reads critically. But more than that, I want to create those spaces where students' voices sing, where we hear those stories, where we build compassion. And that's a risk because students' lives are messy. And my life is messy. But all lives with sufficient scrutiny are messy. And so we have to come from those messy beginnings and open up a place where we build that bright future. And it begins with story. Thank you.